Well, across Iran, the map is on fire. Military bases, radar sites, missile depots, refineries, all have come under heavy US and Israeli attack, turning vast stretches of the Iranian territory into an active war zone. And yet, in the middle of this storm, there is one small piece of Iranian land that still remains mysteriously untouched. Well, we are talking about the Kharg Island, which is a tiny outcrop in the Gulf through which almost all of Iran's oil exports quietly flow. Missiles have not hit it, warplanes have not dived on it, and as per certain reports, the tankers are still coming and going under the cover of the night. But the biggest question is why this single island has been spared in a war that seems to be hitting everything else in Iran. Why Trump hasn't hit a place which remains Iran's main oil export terminal and lifeline of a regime which in many ways remains fragile. Well, don't worry, because in today's edition of From the News Desk, we will answer each of these very questions. From what is Kharg Island, why it hasn't been hit, and if it's hit, what will be the repercussions for Iran, US, and for the rest of the world. Well, Kharg Island is a small rocky island in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 25 to 30 kilometers off Iran's southern coast near Bushehr and only about 5 to 8 kilometers long and a few kilometers wide. But first, let's go back to the 1960s to understand the importance of this piece of land. During the oil boom, Iran, backed by international investment, laid pipelines from its onshore fields in multiple areas and offshore fields in the Gulf straight to Kharg Island, constructing massive storage tanks, pumping stations, and deep water loading berths capable of handling the largest crude tankers on the earth. Well, by the early 1970s, the island had become Iran's primary crude export terminal, and over time, as much as 90% of the country's oil exports have been routed through this very island with a theoretical loading capacity of around 7 million barrels per day. And today, most of that oil is quietly shipped to buyers, especially China, who continues to import Iranian crude despite sweeping US sanctions. In strategic terms, Kharg is not just Iran's export valve, but backbone of Iranian economy. In fact, during the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq repeatedly bombed Kharg's terminal as part of the so-called tanker war, trying to strangle Iran's revenues by hitting ships and infrastructure around the Kharg Island. And even then, Iran improvised alternative routes, but that Iraqi bombing export that whosoever controls, cripples or protects Kharg wields enormous leverage over Iran's economy and by extension over the stability of global oil markets. Now you may think, with Kharg holding so much importance for Iran, why has it remained untouched in the current US-Israel-Iran war, even as other Iranian energy and military sites have been hit very hard? Well, the short answer is that US and Israel understands the political, economic and escalation cost of attacking Kharg Island, and probably that is why it still remains a big red line for Trump. Now let's dive a little deeper. First, let's understand the global economic fallout, which would be immediate and brutal. In fact, as per multiple reports, around 90% of Iran's crude exports transit through Kharg, and knocking such terminal offline would slash Iran's export almost overnight, removing hundreds of thousands to more than 1 million barrels per day from an already tight market. And more worryingly, markets have already shown how jumpy they are at this given point. And US officials, including those in President Trump's administration, are aware that a decisive blow against Kharg could turn an already volatile energy market into a full-blown global crisis that might also hit the US president politically at home. Secondly, Kharg is not just about Iran. It sits a short sail from the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly a quarter of world seaborne crude oil and about a third of its liquefied natural gas pass. In fact, many experts warn that if Washington or Jerusalem take out Kharg, Tehran could retaliate by targeting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and more Gulf energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, triggering a regional energy war and cascading effect on every major economy in the world. In that sense, restraint around Kharg is a less of a favor to Iran than an attempt to avoid pushing Tehran into the most dangerous response options it still holds. And third, there is also a China factor. A significant share of the crude loaded at Kharg ends up in Chinese refineries, giving Beijing a direct stake in the island's continued operations. Destroying or seizing Kharg would not only hit Iran, but it would abruptly cut a key supply line to China, risking a sharp escalation in US-China tensions at the moment when Washington is already managing a big war front. And finally, there is strategy and timing. Reports citing US officials suggest that seizing or disabling Kharg is viewed in some circles not as an opening move, but an endgame option. A way to squeeze Tehran's revenue after its offensive capabilities have been degraded and if diplomacy fails. Well, for now, Kharg remains in a kind of strategic suspense, constantly surveilled, openly discussed, but just barely off limits. Now, what happens if that restraint snaps and Kharg Island is finally attacked? Well, even conservative scenarios outlined by energy analysts paint a picture of a severe economic shock and further escalation in an already dangerous war. In fact, in the immediate terms, a successful strike that disabled Kharg storage tanks, pumping stations, and loading berths would halt Iran's seaborne crude exports at least for weeks or months. Now, many also argue that the loss of Kharg, even temporarily, would blow a multi-billion-dollar monthly hole in Tehran's budget, further slamming the rial and spiking inflation. Globally, things will be even worse. Just imagine a major OPEC producer's main export artery being taken off the map, and that too in the middle of a shooting war near the world's most critical energy choke points. Obviously, there will be cascading effects. Insurers would likely jack up or withdraw coverage for tankers transitioning through Northern Gulf. Freight rates would surge, and more worryingly, some ship owners might pause sailing altogether until they could assess the risk. Now, even if other producers from Saudi Arabia to the United States ramped up the output, but many still warn that price spikes could be violent and prolonged. Well, the strategic aftermath could be even more dangerous. As you know, Iranian hardliners have long threatened that if they cannot sell their own oil, they will ensure that others in the region cannot either. Whether through missiles and drone strikes on Gulf export terminals, harassment of tankers, or attempt to close or mine the Strait of Hormuz. It won't be wrong to say that a blow against Kharg would almost certainly pull more US naval forces in the region, Gulf monarchies, and possibly even NATO allies into a wider maritime confrontation in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea.